Hey everyone, welcome to lesson 12 of Lambda School's mini bootcamp. So this is our 12th and final lesson. I've had a really great time teaching all this material to you guys. I hope that you're enjoying it. I hope that you're both excited and starting to understand both. I hope that you're in this place where there's a balance of starting to understand it and getting excited, but also realizing how deep this stuff can go and how much time and energy it takes to go into it and really get it. Which for me has always been one of the most exciting things about programming, is that every time you learn something new, you just like unlock this whole well of all this complexity. So I hope that a lot of you guys are planning on joining us in the Lambda School full-time course or part-time course to get a more comprehensive understanding of this material. If you were just going through the pre-course for your own personal growth or learning, that's really cool too. And I hope you continue to program and pursue this and learn more, because we've really only scratched the surface of what's possible with JavaScript. So if anyone is joining us for the first time, let me tell you a little bit about Lambda School and myself. So I'm Deandra Ryan Moss. I'm an instructor at Lambda School, and Lambda School is a software engineering and web development immersive. So what we do is we take people who are at a beginning stage of development and we teach them to the point that they're ready to be hired in the field as a full-time web developer. As I mentioned, it is 6 months long, full-time. We do also offer a part-time course in the evening. And we have this really awesome tuition model where you do not have to pay us anything up front. So if you're interested in attending Lambda School but worried about tuition, no fear, because you can actually pay us back over the course of your first 2 years being hired on the job. So if you do not get that full-time computer science job that you're looking for, you don't have to pay us. And as well, that incentivizes us to make sure that you do get hired, which is, we want everyone who goes through Lambda School to end up with that job that they came to Lambda School for. So if you are new to this, this is probably not the best place to jump in, because we are on our 12th and final lesson. The entire course is on YouTube, and we will be starting a new pre-course in May. So if anyone is just popping in, I hope I'll see you in May so you can be with us as we go through and be interactive, ask questions live and all that. Well, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what we saw last night and what we're going to see tonight on our final lesson. So last night was all about recursion, which, as I mentioned, is my favorite JavaScript topic because it is such a mind-melting concept. We discovered what happens when a function calls itself, which is that we actually create a function call and then a smaller function call, and all these function calls nestled inside of each other. And what that actually allows us to accomplish is that we can use functions as a way of looping, in that we can call repeated functions with different arguments until we hit some sort of base case that tells the functions to quit, and then they start to pop back out. So we saw that with a looping example where we counted down. We also saw a few more slightly advanced concepts or recursive examples where we actually calculated some values. So you saw what happens when you use an inner recursive function to, for example, add up numbers. And then we used scope to have a variable that existed outside of that recursion. So that's what we covered last night. There was homework on that. And tonight we're shifting gears a little bit. There's a slight tie into recursion that I'll mention later, but mostly we're actually tying back to everything we've seen from start to finish. So this is a web development bootcamp, but you might have noticed that a lot of what we're doing in JavaScript doesn't seem to directly relate to web development. I have tried to give you examples of how different concepts might be used in apps or projects, but we haven't actually touched websites at all in this entire JavaScript portion. We saw a little bit of web development at the beginning with HTML and CSS, but we haven't really seen exactly how JavaScript ties into all of that. And that is the point of tonight. So JavaScript is a key element of web development, whereas HTML allows us to put different elements on the page and CSS allows us to style those elements. JavaScript provides the hidden functionality. So when you go to a website and you click a button, if you submit a post to Facebook, if you're just even loading your data, if you go to your Facebook page or your Twitter page, all of your entire feed appears. And everything that's going on behind the scenes that allows that kind of dynamic functionality to occur is JavaScript. So JavaScript is in web development. It's just a little behind the scenes. So we're going to look tonight at the DOM, which is how JavaScript and the web page interact. So the DOM is this object that represents the entire website in JavaScript form, which allows us as a developer to go into that object, see what's going on the page, change it a little bit, and add this dynamic component to web development. So like I said, the piece that JavaScript plays is that it is what causes a page to be dynamic, that buttons to work, data to appear, data to be submitted. So it's a really critical piece of the puzzle. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we'll start to look a little bit. We'll do a little review of how CSS and HTML interplay, and then start to bring JavaScript in the mix. All right, let's do it. Okay, so I have up on here a sample web page that I created for you guys. It's pretty similar to something we saw in the first week. And currently there is HTML and CSS going on here. So we can tell there's HTML, of course, because there are actual elements on the screen. So the fact that there's even these boxes and text tells us that we have HTML. We also know that there is CSS because it's styled. We have borders, we have background colors, there's a different font in the subheader, and then we can see that there's some margins and padding going on here as well. So let me actually pop open the code base that corresponds to this web page. So over here, I have a code base with 3 different files. We have our HTML file, our CSS file, and then we have a JavaScript file. So let's start with this one. As we can see, this corresponds to everything on the page. We have our headers up here, then we have a button. I'll actually scoot this over so we can compare even better. We have a button, and then we have another div with a paragraph in it. And of course, up here, we've linked to our style sheet, which contains a little bit of information on, we can see that we have the styling on that subheader. We see that we have some margins and padding and the background color on the border. And then finally, we have this JavaScript page. So this thing, you might recognize some stuff in here. You know, there's variable declarations. You can see that a method is being called here. But I know some of this probably looks a little overwhelming right now. That is perfectly fine. By the end of the lesson, you will understand what is going on in here. So the first thing I want to talk about with this is the idea of linking. So the HTML page itself is always the portal to the web page. So anything else you want to come along with the HTML needs to be linked. For example, we can see that in our header, we've linked in the style sheet. So this is the piece of the code that says, hey, let's bring in the style sheet. If I comment this out, save it, and refresh my page over here, we see that the CSS has gone away. So we need to make sure that we are telling our HTML file to incorporate in the CSS. The same thing applies for JavaScript. So right now, there is JavaScript logic in this file that tells the website what the button should do, but it's not linked in any way. So when I go over here and click the button, nothing happens. So how do we link in our JavaScript file? Well, it's similar to CSS, but a little bit different. It happens in the head, which is, as I mentioned in some of our earlier lessons, the head is where metadata type stuff goes. Actual elements, actual things that appear on the page go on the body, but kind of side notes go on the head. So this is where we will link in our JavaScript. And there's 2 ways to do this, both that utilize something called a script tag. So the first thing we can do is actually write some JavaScript directly in here. So in between these 2 script tags, I can write JavaScript. So I'm going to throw in a console log. I throw this in. I'm going to open the console over here, and then let's refresh the page. And we can see that it worked because our little message appeared in the console. So this technique is good if you just want to test something out really quickly. but it's generally not the way we want to approach bringing in JavaScript. Just like we're allowed to write CSS directly in the page, but we usually don't want to, the same applies to JavaScript. We want separation of concerns. We want any JavaScript to go in a separate file. So instead of writing our JavaScript directly in, usually what we want to do is actually link it in. And we still use a script tag for that, but we need to add a couple other things in here. So first of all, I'm going to add in a type attribute that's text JavaScript. So this will always be set to text JavaScript. And that's just telling the browser, okay, we're going to link in a JavaScript file. And then we need the source. So this is similar to our image tag, where we actually want to link in the source of our JavaScript. And because it's in the same folder, I can just link it in like this. Actually, I don't even think I need that. And then the final thing that we want to throw in is the async keyword. So this is this tells the browser to load everything else before we load our JavaScript. And the reason we want to do that is because, especially if this file is really big and complex, we don't want there to be any delay. We want the user to see the elements on the page immediately. So we throw in the async keyword to make sure that this is happening last. It also can create some issues if some of the logic, oh, I linked in the wrong file. Let's do index.js. So if there's some logic in this file that has to do with some of the elements on the page, we want to make sure it's coming in last so that the elements it's dealing with exist when it loads. So those are the three things you have to remember. Specify the type, specify the source, and then throw in the async keyword. So let's go ahead and save that and see what happens. So now when we click our button, a hidden element appeared on the screen. And in fact, we can actually see that that paragraph was written into our code, but using some CSS, I had kept it hidden. So by default, the display was set to none, which means that by default, that element is gone. But when I click this button, something is happening behind the scene that just changes the display value so that we can now see this. Once again, at this moment, we don't need to worry about the logic inside here because we're going to do a lot of exploration before we build ourselves up to the point where we could write something like this. But by the end of this lesson, you will know how to do this exact thing. So that's kind of exciting. So the big takeaway here is that first of all, giving you an example of some of the things we might use JavaScript for, such as creating the result of a button click and potentially toggling elements on and off the screen. Another important takeaway is that if we're going to use JavaScript in our file or in our projects, we need to make sure that it's linked in. The final takeaway being that JavaScript is pretty cool, and it actually does have to do with web development. So I wanted to show you this because I think it's really important to think about as you get more advanced. But for the rest of this lesson, we will actually be writing in CodePen. And in CodePen, we can write our JavaScript directly in. The linking happens behind the scenes in CodePen. So we don't have to worry about it. But I wanted to let you know that when you're not in a sandbox environment, this is really important and an easy thing to forget at the beginning. All right, so let's start to talk about the DOM. So as I briefly mentioned before, the entire thing that makes it possible for us to manipulate a web page is something called the DOM, which stands for the Document Object Model. So the DOM is an object, a JavaScript object that represents the web page. So we've seen JavaScript objects before. You know, we might have one that represents a user or one that even represents a human. So I could have this object that represents me as a human. Of course, this object isn't literally me, but it's something that represents me. The same idea applies to the DOM. So the DOM isn't literally what's on the screen, but it's a representation of it. And what's cool is that it's bound to what's on the screen so that when we change the DOM, we can actually change the web page. So how do we look at this thing? Well, when we're in a browser like this, there is a global object available to us called document. And document is the thing that represents the entire web page. So this is an incredibly complex JavaScript object. This thing is way more in depth than anything you guys have seen so far. So, and keep in mind that you don't need to know every single thing that's inside of this. I do not know. I don't even come close to having memorized the structure of the document. It's really complex. What you need to know is high level, what is it, how do we use it, and where can I go to look up the different attributes and methods on this thing. So it's a little overwhelming when we use it at first, but I want to just open it up and explore a little bit to give us a sense of what we're working with. So we have this object called the document, and inside it, there are little attributes that represent everything on this page. And this is where something that the browser does that eventually will make our life easier actually is going to make our life a little confusing right now. So the way that this object renders when we log it in the console, it makes it look like we're looking at HTML, which is really nice because we're looking at something that represents HTML. But it can be kind of confusing because we're like, wait, is this JavaScript or is this HTML? So let me be really clear. What we're looking at over here in the console is not HTML. It is actually JavaScript. It's just a JavaScript object designed to model the HTML. And what's really convenient is as we highlight all these things in this object, what it represents on the page lights up. So it's really easy to see how this corresponds to the page in front of us. So beyond containing just these items for everything on the page, this document object also contains a ton of methods that are going to be super useful for manipulating the page. So that is what we are going to dive into. All right, so let's start to look at some of the methods on document. So let me go over here. For some reason, this image is not wanting to load today. Let me see if I can, oh, there it goes. Oh yes, so, and one more thing I want to say before we dive in, which is that CodePen is kind of a blessing and a curse. It's really great because we can have our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript right in front of us in this really clear way, but it does some weird stuff that might make our life a little frustrating. One thing that happens is as we start to write JavaScript down here, the page likes to reload. So you'll see the page reloading a million times over here, especially the picture. Don't worry about it. It's just CodePen being a little hacky. The other thing that's a little unfortunate is that we will be looking at our console a lot. Whenever we start to type JavaScript in, if we start to type JavaScript in but don't complete it, sometimes we get errors over here. So we'll see a lot of error messages over here. Just kind of disregard them, and I'll bring your attention to what in the console you need to look at. Okay, so the first thing I want to teach you, or the first method that I want to teach you, has to do with selecting. So when we're doing DOM manipulation, when we're using JavaScript to manipulate this web page in some way, the first thing we need to do is grab whatever element we want to mess with. So we have to do something called selecting. So if I, for example, wanted to change something about this header, I would need some way in JavaScript of selecting it and saving it into a variable. If instead I wanted to grab both paragraphs, I would need to select them. So there are several different methods for selecting. And I'm going to start with a method called getElementsByClass. So once again, this is just the same. This is just the same kind of thing that we've seen with other objects, right? We have this global object that's available to us, and on it there is a method. So we're able to use that method, and of course we're going to pass something into it. So getElementsByClass name. Really long method name. So this, as you might imagine from the name, allows us to grab elements based on their class. And up here, if we look at the HTML, we can see that both of these paragraphs have a class of child. So I'm going to go ahead and put child in as an argument. And we can use this method now to grab these paragraphs. Of course, I will need to save them somewhere. So we'll do these. And now I have used this method to grab the children, or more the JavaScript object that represents these two paragraphs, and I've saved them into this variable called peas. So to make sure that that is working as we expected, let's go ahead and console log our peas variable. Okay, so over here we can see that that peas appears in our console, and it's something called an HTML collection, which is, for simplicity's sake, you can think of this thing as being an array. It's slightly different than an array, but it's very similar. It's just a data structure designed to hold these two elements. So if we open this thing up, we can see that there are two different children, and each one of these is incredibly complex. But if we kind of scroll through, we can see, oh, hey, here's the text that we can see on the page. And if I look at the second one, we can also see that same text. So as I mentioned, these DOM objects are extremely complex, and you don't need to memorize everything on here. I don't know anyone who has all these things memorized. You just need to know how to look up the things that you need for specific tasks. So we have managed to use this method to create this variable called peas that contains this array-like data structure. And within that array is basically these two different paragraphs. So if we wanted to change them in some way, we would have access to them. So that is our first selector, is get elements by class name. It will give us all the elements with a specific class name. The next thing I want to show you is called get element by ID. And we will use this to grab the parent. So this big old div out here has an ID of parent. So I will call this parent in, and let me change this to get element by ID. And notice that now it's element singular because we know that IDs are unique. So there can only be one element with, let me actually spell the ID name right. So there can only possibly be one element with the ID name. So over here, we see that we managed to grab this parent, and if we open it, it contains all that information in there. So that first get elements by class name gave us a collection of elements. This just gives us a single element. All right, let's show you another way of selecting. There are two more I want to show you right now, and they're both quick selectors. So let's say that we wanted to get all the paragraphs. So we know that we got them based on a child class. Let's say we had a third paragraph in here. It did not have the class child. Why is this not appearing? Can you guys hear me? Is the sound back? Hopefully that means you can hear me. Sorry about any shyness. Okay, well, I'm gonna. Okay. I'm getting a lot of feedback about things being choppy and the screen cutting in and out. I've done my best, but we might just have to carry on. I apologize about technical difficulties the last 2 nights. I'm not sure what's going on, but I'm going to upgrade my internet to make sure that this doesn't happen anymore. So let's talk about the next selector, which is a query selector. So if we use documents dot query selector all, we can now grab items based on just the element type. For example, before we could only grab certain classes or ID, but now if we want to grab every single paragraph, including this third paragraph that doesn't have a class, we can do that using query selector all. And if we console log our paragraphs, all right. It looks like the video feed is cut out. Give me 1 second to try and resolve this. Hey guys, any luck now with being able to hear me / see me? All right, I wonder if we were just having trouble with the Google Hangouts app for some reason, because I restarted that and it seemed to fix it. So I will share my screen again and see if we can't continue learning about selectors. All right, 1 second. All right. So over here, I did get rid of that image on the page because I'm wondering if the constant reloading of it was part of the problem. So as a little recap of what happened before things fell apart, so we looked at a couple different selectors. We saw that there is a selector method to get everything by class or to select an element by ID. But now we're looking at query selector all, which is a much more versatile, method, because if we want, for example, all of the paragraphs, we can put in P and it loads out all the paragraphs. So over here, all right, guys, are you still having audio video problems? We might have to get creative here. All right, can you guys hear and see me now? Okay, I'm wondering if CodePen is part of the problem, which is unfortunate because I was going to use CodePen to show this to you, but we actually can do it without CodePen if we need to. So I'm going to try that and see if it's working a little better. So I've pulled back up this this Sublime text. So this is just an actual code base, and we can write some HTML here or some JavaScript here if we want. So, oh, good suggestion of JS at all. Okay, so let's try, I'm gonna just try using, I'm just gonna try doing it in Sublime Text, which is maybe not as ideal as CodePen, but for some reason it's creating all sorts of problems for us tonight. So hopefully this resolves the issue, and definitely keep giving me feedback in Slack if we continue to have problems. So as a little recap of selectors we've seen so far, let me actually edit this real quick and throw a couple more paragraphs on here. So I'm going to change this around a little bit just so we can use this code base for our purposes tonight. So I'll throw 3 paragraphs on here. And let's give these ones a class of child. And the third one, I will not give the class. And then we'll give the div that they're inside of an ID of parent. Okay. So as we saw, or maybe didn't see, if things are choppy, we can select these items. So if we want to, for example, here, let me pull these separate actually, so you can see both at the same time. All right. So if we want to select all of the items on the page with the class of child, we can use document dot, sorry, that's get elements by class name, the child, and this function, this method will return all of the elements that have the class of child. So in this case, the 2 paragraphs. If instead we wanted to do ID, we could do get elements by ID and throw in parent, and we would be able to get out this div that has the ID of parent. The next selector that is a little more versatile and one of my favorites is query selector all. And so query selector all will give us, we can use it to get specific HTML elements. So if we wanted every paragraph, we could use this. So I will go ahead and save it into a variable called all keys, and then I'll console log it. And then over here, if I refresh the page, we can see that there's a node list that contains all of our paragraphs on the page. Even the hidden one is in this list. So we can use this to grab all the paragraphs. If we want, we can also use this to grab classes and IDs. So if we wanted all children, we would just do dot for class and child. And now notice that only 2 children appeared over here in our console, the 2 that have the class of child. And we can even look inside and see the class name child listed in there. So that is another way of selecting. And then the final way I want to show you right now is just query selector. So the difference between query selector and query selector all is that query selector will only give us the first item. So even though there are multiple, so we'll do first child over here, just to clarify. So even though there are multiple elements with this class of child, when we use query selector, it will only give us the very first one. So let's go ahead and refresh. And we see that just the first one appeared here in our console. So that is selecting. By itself, it's not very interesting. Well, it is kind of cool to be able to see that we can use these document methods to grab different elements. And using these four methods I showed you, you could really grab anything on the screen. But we want to be able to do more than just grab elements. We also want to be able to manipulate in some way. And that's what I'm going to show you next. Oh, and we have a question that I'll just address, which is, William asked, if you call the parent element using elements by ID, will it also affect the children elements that are within the div? Yes and no. So, so just by selecting, nothing's actually affected, right? We've grabbed it, but we haven't done anything to it. So let me pull up that example that you said of, if we instead selected parent, so by selecting parent, we've grabbed the parent and we've also grabbed everything inside it. So just by selecting, nothing's going to change. But using the selector, we could alter the parent, or we could use it to alter any of the children. So if we wanted to alter everything inside this parent, including the children elements, we could start by selecting the parent. We also have a question about get elements by tag name. I will just address that a little indirectly and say that there are a ton of these methods. So there is a ton of stuff we can do with this document. So I'm going to try to introduce you to the most basic one that I think will help you get off the ground. But there are a ton out there. So if you're curious, I definitely recommend Googling around and looking through some of the other things you can do with the document. Because what I'm going to be showing you in the lesson tonight is really just scratching the surface. All right, so let's talk about manipulating now. So I'm going to start by grabbing that very first paragraph. So I will do selector E, and we know that this will, actually let's do query select of dot child. And we know this will give us the first paragraph because these two are the only two with that class name. So I've gone ahead and grabbed it. Now this P variable is available to me. So the P variable is also an object, and it contains lots of cool attributes, lots of cool properties. One of them is something called inner HTML. So let me go ahead and log this so that we can see what this inner HTML attribute is on our paragraph. And when I refresh, it's actually the text that the paragraph contains. So if we wanted to know the text on an element that we've selected, we can use this attribute. But we can also use it to alter that. So just like in any other JavaScript object, we can use dot notation, oops, right? We can use dot notation to change the value. So I don't think grandest is a word, but that is fine. So now when I refresh it, we see that even though directly in the HTML, we've written in that paragraph 1 has the text of paragraph 1, now we can use the object version, DOM representation of elements, to actually change that text. So we've done our first bit of actual manipulation. We have changed the value of the text on this paragraph. The next thing I want to show you is on an image. So let me throw an image on here real quick. 1 second. Steal this link. Oop. Actually, 1 second. All right. So I'm going to there we go. So it should be an image on our page now. It's taking a very long time to load. I might not do. I wonder if is this great site that just gives you stock images. But I wonder if this is part of our connection issues. So definitely let me know if we start to have connection issues now that I've thrown this on. Oh, so we have an image on screen. So if we want to select it, first of all, there are a lot of different ways we could do it, but I'm going to use Query Selector. So, all right, I think Lorem Pixel might be the culprit. All right, guys, is it back at all? By the way, I do want to say I appreciate you guys bearing with me through all the technical difficulties. I'm starting to get worried that our lesson tonight may be a little doomed. I keep going, and hopefully things get a little better. If not, I might just have to send you a link of the lesson I did last month for this. I'm really fortunate because I would love to teach you live, but I'm not sure what is going on with the internet tonight. But let's try to carry on for now. I'm going to this example because it just seems to be making the situation worse. Let's go ahead and try a couple other things. So, okay. So let's talk about class reassignment. So we can find out what classes different elements have and also reassign them using this document object. So we have, let's start by selecting something. I will grab, once again, my first paragraph. Okay, so I grab paragraph, and then I can actually look at an attribute called class name. And this will tell me what class is on my paragraph. So if we console log class name, and save. we want to, let's do class child. So we can see that it logs the class on the that we got. It use the same thing to actually reassign the class name. So just like we were able to reassign the value in HTML, we can change the class to child. Now if we go over here and inspect elements,